Hi everyone. As many of you already know, Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener is set in a law office of Wall Street and is narrated by a lawyer who hires a quiet copyist named Bartleby. At first, Bartleby works efficiently, but he gradually begins to refuse tasks, and he does so by always using the same formula. I would prefer not to. In this presentation, I'd like to revisit this story not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a narrative that turns opacity into an ethical talent, a talent that ultimately destabilizes the narrator rather than revealing Bartleby. Reading Bartleby today allows us to reflect on what happens when interpretation itself becomes an ethical demand, and when refusing that demand generates discomfort. Very briefly, the story revolves around the lawyer's growing inability to understand Bartleby. Bartleby doesn't explain himself, doesn't justify his refusals, and doesn't change his language. His behavior remains minimal and opaque. This creates a crisis for the narrator, who is deeply invested in order and interpretability. He repeatedly tries to classify Bartleby as lazy, as ill, immoral, but none of these categories fully applies. And what unsettles the narrator, and maybe us as readers, isn't simply Bartleby's silence, but the fact that interpretation itself fails. The way I see it, this dynamic becomes especially relevant today because, in contemporary societies, individuals are often expected to explain themselves, to make their identities and positions legible. For example, in public and semi-public spheres, or spaces like social networks, institutional settings, or in the media discourse. In these cases, opacity is rarely perceived as neutral because silence or refusal often generate suspicion and even ethical unease. Interpretation becomes a moral expectation. To be ethical is frequently equated with being visible and transparent. What Bartleby anticipates is precisely this discomfort, the tension that arises when interpretation is demanded but remains impossible. Bartleby the Scrivener has generated a diverse body of criticism. For example, Leo Marx reads Bartleby in relation to alienation and the contradictions of 19th century American capitalism. Gilles Deleuze interprets Bartleby's formula as a radical gesture of refusal, a linguistic and ethical stance that suspends action and meaning. Other critics, like Christopher Castiglia, have emphasized the story's engagement with liberal subjectivity and moral responsibility, and so on and so forth. These approaches differ, but often share an implicit expectation that Bartleby's opacity should be interpreted or explained in some way. My reading shifts the focus from Bartleby's meaning to the ethical consequences of the narrator's inability to understand him. I'm interested in what happens when meaning cannot be secured. So, the story becomes less about deciphering Bartleby and more about examining the ethical limits of interpretation itself. This paper has three main objectives. First, I aim to reframe Bartleby's opacity not as a narrative problem, but as an ethical talent that eludes interpretive closure. Second, I focus on the lawyer-narrator and I analyze how his habitual modes of interpretation, moral, legal, rational, repeatedly fail when confronted with Bartleby's refusal of explanation. And finally, I reconsider the relation between static and dynamic characterization in the story, suggesting that the apparent immobility of Bartleby generates narrative movement by forcing the narrator into a progressive crisis of understanding. Methodologically, this paper mainly relies on close textual analysis. It draws on narratology, particularly concepts of narrative voice, focalization, and characterization, to examine how interpretation is structured within the text. The analysis is also informed by ethical criticism, approaches that question the assumption that understanding or appropriation are always ethically desirable, specifically in encounters with radical otherness, as explained, for example, by Emmanuel Levinas and Derek Attridge. And finally, I make a selective use of previous criticism as tools to clarify the ethical and temporal assumptions of the narrator. At this point, I want to focus on narrative voice. Bartleby, the Scrivener, is told from the perspective of a character who's a lawyer, and this is crucial. The lawyer isn't a neutral observer. The lawyer is deeply invested in routine and bureaucratic rationality. His worldview depends on categorization. He expects people to be readable, explainable. His work, his behavior, and even his moral responsibility are all organized around the expectation of legibility. Todd F. Davis explains this mindset through his distinction between what he calls horological and chronometrical modes of experience. The lawyer operates within a horological logic. Time is structured, regulated, and always oriented toward productivity and control. Davis compares this with chronometrical time, which refers to moments that interrupt routine and cannot be measured in terms of productivity or usefulness. Chronometrical time is ethical rather than functional. It is the time of encounter, responsibility, and disturbance. What happens? Well, Bartleby introduces chronometrical time into a strictly horological world. The lawyer experiences Bartleby as an interruption that his temporal logic cannot work out, cannot accommodate. And from this perspective, anything that doesn't move forward, that doesn't fit into a functional rhythm, becomes a problem, and Bartleby's presence will expose the limits of this interpretive framework, because the tools the lawyer uses in his professional life somehow fails him when he tries to deal with Bartleby. Against this background, Bartleby suddenly appears, and he's a radically opaque figure. His language is minimal and repetitive. He doesn't explain himself, doesn't justify his refusals, and doesn't vary his formula. I would prefer not to, again and again. Bartleby also appears static. He doesn't evolve psychologically. He barely follows a narrative arc of development. His opacity is not silence in the strict sense, but a radically limited form of speed that eludes or resists explanation. And this opacity is not presented as a mystery to be solved. The text doesn't offer hidden clues or a final revelation, so to speak. Instead, Bartleby's refusal of explanation remains consistent, remains unresolved, and this destabilizes the narrator's interpretive habits. The narrator explicitly acknowledges this failure when he confesses, "I could not reach him." He can provide Bartleby with food, with shelter, but he cannot understand him. And this is where the ethical tension appears. The lawyer repeatedly assumes that ethical responsibility requires comprehension. If he can explain Bartleby, categorize him, or assign him a motive, a reason, then he can act correctly. But when interpretation tries to impose meaning where there is none, it can become a coercive act. What appears as a moral concern can easily turn into a kind of interpretive violence. Bartleby's refusal exposes the limits of an ethics based on transparency and explanation. The ethical failure I'm referring to is not Bartleby's, but the narrator's, and more in general, the failure of an ethical model that assumes that understanding is always necessary. The contrast with the other office workers makes this even clearer. Nippers, Turkey, and Gingernet are workers that we can read easily. Their names, bodies, ages, behaviors all correspond to social and narrative types that we can recognize. They can be explained and therefore managed. Their eccentricities are readable and therefore tolerable. These employees functions as foils of Bartleby because they are immediately readable. Their nicknames translate bodily traits and social functions into language. For example, Turkey. Turkey is a name that reflects his physical excess and his clumsiness. In contrast, Bartleby's opacity eludes this system of social readability altogether. He cannot be reduced to a role, to a diagnosis. So, the story stages legibility as a social norm and opacity as a disturbance of that norm. What this analysis shows is that the coherence of the narrative doesn't depend on uncovering Bartleby's motivations. Rather, it depends on tracing the narrator's gradual disorientation. Bartleby reveals very little about himself, but a great deal about the assumptions and the limits that guide the interpretive practices of the narrator. So, interpretation becomes the central problem of the text, in my view. In conclusion, Bartleby, the Scrivener, anticipates how contemporary cultures sometimes equate ethical responsibility with transparency and visibility. Bartleby's refusal of exposure challenges both the bureaucratic rationality of 19th century and our expectations of self-explanation. I think that the text invites us to reconsider opacity not as a failure, but as an ethical challenge, and silence as a form of resistance rather than absence, maybe. Okay, and I'd like to end with this question. What happens when interpretation becomes the problem? Not because it fails, but because it demands too much. Well, Bartleby suggests that when interpretation becomes an ethical obligation, it can easily turn into a form of pressure. The demand to explain oneself, to become transparent, may silence other forms of ethical relation, including the possibility of respecting opacity. Thank you very much for listening to me. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to, no duden en plantearme cualquier pregunta en inglés o en español. Muchas gracias.